When I found my son sitting on a park bench with my grandson and 3 broken suitcases, I knew someone had just destroyed his life. Next to him, my 6-year-old grandson was hugging a worn-out teddy bear, holding it so tightly it looked like the only thing he had left in the world. At their feet were 3 suitcases. One of them was cracked down the side like someone had kicked it down a flight of stairs. My son, Daniel, had always been the confident one. Lead software engineer. 6-figure salary. A house in one of the gated communities north of Portland. But that evening he looked like a man whose entire life had just collapsed. "Why aren't you at work?" I asked. He looked up slowly. His eyes were red. "I got fired, Dad." The words landed like a stone. "Fired? Why?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "That's not even the worst part." He nodded toward the suitcases. Laura changed the locks. Laura was his wife. And the daughter of Victor Carver, a man who liked to remind everyone that his family built half this city. Daniel rubbed his face. "Her father said our bloodline wasn't worthy of their name." My grandson looked up at me. "Grandpa, are we poor now?" Daniel looked away immediately, like that question hurt more than anything his father-in-law had said. For a moment I said nothing. I looked at the broken suitcase. Then I looked at my son. Then at the little boy holding that old teddy bear like it was the last thing keeping his world together. And then I smiled. "Get in the truck," I said calmly. Daniel frowned. "Dad. I just need a place to stay tonight." I opened the door of my old pickup. "We're not going home." He hesitated. "Then where are we going?" I started the engine. To remind a man of something he should have checked before insulting my family. Daniel stared at me, confused. Victor Carver believed he had just thrown us out into the street. What he didn't know was that the bank holding the mortgage on his company, his mansion, and half his empire belonged to me. And insulting my family was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. Daniel sat silently in the passenger seat while I drove. My grandson Toby sat in the back, still holding that worn-out teddy bear, staring quietly out the window as the city lights passed by. Every few seconds he glanced toward the suitcases in the truck bed, like he still couldn't understand how their entire life had suddenly been packed into 3 broken pieces of luggage. After a while Daniel spoke. "I'm sorry, Dad. I kept my eyes on the road." "For what?" "For dragging you into this mess." The old pickup rattled as we turned onto the highway. "You didn't drag me into anything," I said. Daniel shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. Victor planned this." That made me glance at him. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in the seat and stared through the windshield. "This morning he called me into his office. I thought it was about the new system rollout. I built that software, Dad. 3 years of work. And..." He slid a termination notice across the desk. I felt my jaw tighten. "No warning." Daniel gave a quiet, humorless laugh. He didn't even look up from his phone. The truck engine hummed beneath us. He said the company was downsizing. I snorted. "You don't downsize the lead engineer who built your entire infrastructure." That's exactly what I told him. Daniel rubbed his temples. That's when he pressed the security button. "Security." 2 guards came in. He paused. They stood on both sides of my chair like I was about to steal something. My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. They walked me out of the office. He stared down at his hands. Half the floor was watching. His voice lowered. People I'd worked with for years suddenly looked away like they didn't know me. The highway lights passed rhythmically across the windshield. "They didn't even let me pack my desk," he said. "What happened when you got home?" I asked. Daniel looked out the window again. "My key didn't work." I didn't say anything. There was a locksmith truck parked outside. He swallowed. The new locks were already shining on the door. How long had you been gone? 40 minutes. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a reaction. This was a plan. Daniel continued quietly. I knocked on the door. Laura opened it. And she didn't let me in. His voice had that hollow sound people get when they're repeating something they still can't believe happened. She said she couldn't be with someone who couldn't provide security anymore. A cold stillness settled inside my chest. She chose her father's money over her husband, I said. Daniel didn't answer. After a moment he continued. Then Victor walked out. His voice hardened slightly. He kicked the suitcases down the front steps. Toby shifted quietly in the back seat. What exactly did he say? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he repeated the words slowly. He said. Your bloodline is weak, Daniel. Daniel looked down. Then he said. Men like you serve families like mine. For a moment the only sound in the truck was the engine. Victor Carver. I had met the man exactly twice. Once at Daniel's wedding. Once at a Christmas dinner 3 years ago. Both times he shook my hand like he was touching something slightly dirty. Men like Victor build their entire identity around status. Money. Last names. Power. What they never understand is that real power doesn't introduce itself. It waits. Quietly. I turned off the highway and took the long road toward the lake. Daniel noticed. Dad, where are we going? Home. He frowned. Your cabin? Yes. But what about Victor? I allowed myself a small smile. Victor Carver believed today was the day he destroyed my son's life. What he didn't know was that while he was throwing suitcases down his front steps, his entire empire was already standing on the edge of a financial cliff. And by the time the sun came up tomorrow, that empire would already belong to me. By the time we reached my cabin by the lake, my son had lost his job, his house, and his wife, all in the same day. Toby was already asleep in the back seat, his arms still wrapped around the teddy bear like it was armor. Daniel carried the suitcases inside. He moved slowly, like a man who still expected someone to tell him this was all a mistake. The cabin wasn't much. 1 bedroom. A small kitchen. A wood stove. The kind of place Victor Carver would probably call a shack. Daniel looked around. Dad. I didn't realize things had gotten this bad for you. I didn't answer that. Instead, I started a fire in the stove. You and Toby can take the bedroom, I said. Daniel shook his head. No. That's your room. It's fine. He ran a hand through his hair. I'll get another job. It might take a few weeks, but I'll figure it out. He looked around the cabin again. First thing I'm fixing is your roof, he said. Like losing everything in one day wasn't enough to stop him from thinking about someone else. That made me pause. You just lost your job, your house, and your wife, I said. And the first thing you want to do is fix my roof? Daniel shrugged. You've taken care of me my whole life. He gave a tired smile. Seems fair. That was the moment I knew Victor Carver had made the biggest mistake of his life. Because men like Victor measure people by money. But character. That's something they can't buy. Later that night, after Daniel and Toby were asleep, I stepped outside onto the porch. The lake was completely still. I took out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. The call connected on the second ring. Rebecca, I said. There was a short silence. Then a calm voice answered. Harrison. She didn't sound surprised. It's been a while. It has. Another pause. Should I assume this call means you're coming back? She asked. Yes. Her tone sharpened immediately. Target? Victor Carver. I could almost hear her pulling up files. Carver Industries, she said a moment later. Yes. Another few seconds passed. Then Rebecca spoke again. Well, this is interesting. How bad? Very. She sounded almost amused now. Harrison. Victor Carver is drowning. I leaned against the porch railing. Explain. His company is leveraged to the ceiling. Loans, private credit lines, bridge financing. If one thing goes wrong, the whole structure collapses. How soon? Rebecca didn't hesitate. Monday. I looked out over the lake. Today was Friday. Who holds the debt? I asked. Several regional banks, she replied. Good. There was a pause. Then she asked the question she always asked before something big. What are your orders? I looked out across the dark water. Buy the debt, I said calmly. Every loan. Every credit line. Every dollar Victor Carver owes. Rebecca didn't hesitate. I'll start making calls. And Rebecca? Yes. Do it quietly. Her voice turned cold. When have I ever done anything loudly? The line went silent. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stared out across the lake. Victor Carver believed he had humiliated my son. He believed he had thrown us out into the street. But what he didn't understand was that humiliation works both ways. And in 48 hours, the man who called my bloodline worthless was going to discover that my son now owned every dollar of his empire. Saturday morning at the cabin was quiet. Too quiet for a man who had just started dismantling another man's empire. Daniel woke up early and stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the pale morning sky. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the trees. Hard to believe yesterday actually happened, he said. I sat at the wooden table on the porch. It happened. He nodded slowly. I keep thinking Laura will call. She might, I said. But it won't be for the reason you hope. Daniel didn't answer. Inside the cabin, Toby was still asleep. Kids have a strange ability to shut the world out when they need to. Adults aren't so lucky. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. I still don't understand something. What? Victor didn't have to destroy my life like that, Daniel said quietly. He could have just fired me. I looked out over the water. Yes, he did. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Men like Victor don't just want to win. They want witnesses. Daniel said nothing. They want people watching when they crush someone, I continued. They want the humiliation to be public. Daniel sighed. Well, he got that part. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then my phone vibrated on the table. Rebecca. I answered immediately. Update. Her voice was calm and efficient. We started acquiring the debt this morning. How much? 30% of Carver Industries' outstanding loans are already under Thorn Capital control. Daniel looked at me. I stood up and walked a few steps away from the porch. Speed it up. We're working through intermediaries, she said. If we move too fast, the banks will realize something's happening. Good. Another pause. Also, Rebecca continued, we've confirmed something interesting. What? Victor Carver is hosting a charity gala tonight. I stopped walking. Where? The Meridian Hotel downtown. Of course he was. Victor loved rooms full of wealthy people applauding his generosity. Who's attending? I asked. Most of the city's investors, Rebecca said. Politicians. Board members. Media. Daniel was watching me now. He could tell something had changed. Perfect, I said. Rebecca paused. You're planning something. Yes. Her voice lowered slightly. You want this to be public. I looked back toward the cabin. Yes. Because Victor Carver had humiliated my son in public. It was only fair the world watched what happened next. Continue buying the debt, I said. How much will we control by tonight? Rebecca checked something. If everything clears, about 60%. That was enough. Good. What's the plan? She asked. I looked out across the lake. Tonight, I said calmly. Victor Carver is going to learn what happens when you humiliate the wrong family. There was silence on the line. And Harrison, Rebecca said carefully. Yes. You're not planning to save him, are you? No. I ended the call. Daniel walked toward me. What's going on? I slid the phone back into my pocket. Get dressed, I said. For what? We're going to a party tonight. Daniel stared at me like I had lost my mind. A party? Yes. At the Meridian Hotel. Realization slowly spread across his face. That's Victor's charity gala. I nodded. Daniel shook his head. Dad, we can't just walk in there. I smiled slightly. Oh, we're not walking in. He frowned. What does that mean? I picked up my truck keys. It means, I said calmly, that by the time we walk into that ballroom, Victor Carver's empire will already belong to us. Daniel stared at me in silence. For the first time since I found him on that park bench, my son began to smile. Because tonight, Victor Carver was going to lose everything. By the time we reached downtown that evening, the Meridian Hotel was already glowing with light. Black cars lined the street in front of the entrance. Valets moved quickly between them while guests in expensive suits and glittering dresses stepped out onto the red carpet. Victor Carver loved events like this. Rooms full of wealthy people applauding his generosity. Cameras flashing. Politicians shaking his hand. To the public, he was the perfect businessman. Successful. Charitable. Untouchable. Daniel stared through the windshield as I parked across the street. I used to come here with Laura, he said quietly. I looked at the hotel entrance. Then tonight will feel familiar. Daniel didn't smile. Inside the ballroom, the gala was already underway. The room was enormous, filled with crystal chandeliers and round tables covered in white linen. Waiters moved quietly through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. The place was packed. Investors. Politicians. Business owners. The kind of people Victor Carver liked to surround himself with when he wanted to look powerful. At the center of the room stood a stage. And on that stage stood Victor Carver. He looked exactly the same as the last time I had seen him. Tall. Perfect suit. That confident smile he used when speaking to a room full of people who believed every word he said. And thanks to the generosity of our investors, Victor was saying into the microphone, Carver Industries continues to support the future of this city. Applause filled the room. Daniel and I stepped inside quietly. No one noticed us at first. People like Victor rarely noticed the men standing quietly at the back of the room. Victor continued speaking. Tonight isn't about business, he said smoothly. It's about community. Another round of applause. Daniel leaned closer to me. Dad, are you sure about this? Yes. But what exactly are we doing? I watched Victor on the stage. We're letting him finish. Daniel frowned. Finish what? His speech. Victor raised his glass. To progress. To leadership. And to the families who built this city. More applause. I checked the time. Rebecca had said 60%. That meant the banks were already starting to notice something strange. Victor took a sip of champagne. Then a man in a dark suit hurried toward the stage from the side of the room. Victor noticed him immediately. The man leaned close and whispered something in his ear. For a split second, Victor's smile froze. Just for a moment. Then he laughed and waved the man away like it was nothing. But I knew that look. The first crack. Daniel saw it too. What was that? He whispered. The beginning, I said. Victor cleared his throat and continued speaking. As I was saying. Another man approached the stage. This one moved faster. He looked even more nervous. He leaned close to Victor again and spoke quickly. Victor's smile disappeared completely this time. The room began to murmur. Something was wrong. Victor stepped away from the microphone and spoke sharply to the two men. They looked pale. Victor turned back toward the crowd. And that was when he saw us. For the first time that evening, Victor Carver stopped speaking. His eyes locked onto Daniel. Then they shifted slowly to me. Recognition spread across his face. First confusion. Then irritation. Then something colder. Victor stepped back to the microphone. Well, he said loudly, forcing a smile. It seems we have unexpected guests tonight. Several heads in the crowd turned toward us. Then more. Soon half the room was looking in our direction. Daniel stood still beside me. Victor chuckled lightly. My former son-in-law, he continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. And, his father. A few people in the audience laughed politely. Victor leaned slightly toward the microphone. Gentlemen, he said, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. I believe the charity donation line is at the back of the room. The laughter was louder this time. Daniel's hands tightened slowly at his sides. I could feel the anger building in him. But I simply looked at Victor. And smiled. Because in that exact moment, every bank holding Victor Carver's debt had just received the same notification. Control of the loans had changed hands. Victor Carver just didn't know it yet. And in less than 60 seconds, the entire room was going to find out. The laughter in the ballroom slowly faded. People were still smiling, but now many of them were looking at us with curiosity. Victor Carver adjusted his cufflinks and gave the crowd another confident smile. Well, he said into the microphone, it appears tonight's charity event has attracted more attention than usual. A few polite chuckles moved through the room. Daniel stood beside me, his shoulders tense. Dad, he whispered. Maybe we should just leave. I shook my head. Not yet. On stage, Victor leaned casually against the podium. Daniel, he said loudly, making sure the entire ballroom could hear him. If you're here to apologize, I suggest you do it quickly. A few people laughed again. Otherwise, Victor continued, security will escort you out. Again. More laughter. Daniel's hands clenched into fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. I could feel the pressure building inside him, the humiliation, the anger, the memory of being thrown out of his own home. But he stayed silent. I took a step forward. Victor noticed immediately. His smile faded just slightly. And you must be the father, he said. His voice carried across the room. I remember you now. The fisherman. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the crowd. Tell me, Victor continued, did you bring your fishing rod tonight, or are you here to collect a donation? More laughter. Daniel shifted beside me. For a second I thought he might step forward. Might say something. Might lose control. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward us now. Hundreds of people watching. Waiting. Judging. But I kept walking. Slowly. Calmly. People near the back of the room began stepping aside as I moved forward. Victor watched me approach the stage. "Sir," he said sharply, "this is a private event." I stopped about 10 feet from the stage. "You're right," I said calmly. Victor smirked. "I'm glad we understand each other." I nodded slightly. "Which is why I find it interesting that you're still standing there." A murmur moved through the crowd. Victor frowned. "I beg your pardon." Before I could answer, a phone rang near the front of the room. One of Victor's executives glanced down at his screen. His face changed instantly. Another phone rang. Then another. Within seconds, several different people near the stage were staring at their phones with the same expression. Shock. Victor noticed. "What is it?" he demanded. No one answered. One of the executives hurried onto the stage and whispered something in his ear. Victor's expression hardened. "Handle it," he muttered. But the man didn't move. Instead, he whispered again. Longer this time. Victor's eyes widened slightly. He grabbed the phone from the man's hand. The ballroom had gone completely quiet. Victor stared at the screen. Then he looked up. Straight at me. For the first time that evening. There was no arrogance in his eyes. Only confusion. "What did you do?" he said. His voice wasn't loud anymore. Just sharp. I folded my hands behind my back. "Nothing yet." The executive beside him leaned closer again. "Sir, every bank is calling." Victor grabbed the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "Please excuse me for a moment." He stepped away from the podium and answered his phone. We could all hear his voice echo slightly through the quiet ballroom. "Yes." Pause. "No, that's impossible." Another pause. Victor's face went pale. "You're telling me every loan was transferred overnight?" The room erupted into whispers. Victor looked around the ballroom. Then his eyes locked on me again. "Who bought them?" he demanded into the phone. Another pause. Victor slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His hand was shaking now. "What's happening?" Daniel whispered beside me. His voice was tight with disbelief. I looked at the stage. Victor Carver stood frozen under the chandelier lights, surrounded by investors, politicians, and reporters. His entire empire was collapsing in real time. And for the first time in his life, everyone was watching him lose. Victor raised the microphone again. His voice was no longer confident. "Who did this?" he demanded. The room fell silent. I took one more step forward. The entire ballroom turned toward me. Hundreds of eyes watching. Waiting. And I said calmly. "I did." For several seconds after I said it, the entire ballroom stayed silent. Victor Carver stood frozen on the stage, staring at me like he was trying to understand whether he had heard correctly. "You?" he repeated slowly. The microphone in his hand trembled slightly. "You bought my company's debt." I took another calm step forward. "Not just the company," I said. A ripple of quiet whispers spread through the crowd. Victor forced a laugh. "That's impossible." His eyes moved quickly across the room, searching for support from the investors seated at the front tables. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice suddenly louder, "this is exactly the kind of ridiculous claim desperate people make when they want attention." A few uncertain chuckles moved through the room. Victor pointed toward me. "This man lives in a fishing cabin by the lake," he said. "He drives a 20-year-old pickup truck." More people in the crowd laughed nervously. Victor smiled again, trying to regain control. "And tonight he wants you all to believe that he somehow bought the financial structure of Carver Industries overnight." The room was watching now. Not laughing. Watching. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Victor noticed immediately. "Security," he said sharply. Two men in suits near the side of the ballroom began moving toward me. Daniel shifted beside me. For a second I felt the tension in him again, the anger, the humiliation from the night before. His fists tightened. But he stayed where he was. Waiting. Watching. Just like I had taught him. I held up my hand calmly. "Before you remove me," I said, "you might want to check something." Victor narrowed his eyes. "What exactly?" I pulled a folded document from my jacket and handed it to the nearest waiter. "Give this to Mr. Carver." The waiter hesitated. Then walked toward the stage. Victor snatched the document from his hand. He unfolded it slowly. At first his face showed nothing. Then the color began draining from it. Someone in the crowd leaned forward. "What is it?" a man whispered. Victor read the page again. Then again. The microphone in his hand dropped slightly. "No," he said under his breath. Daniel looked at me. "What did you give him?" "The transfer confirmation," I said quietly. Victor stepped back from the podium. "This isn't real," he said. His voice had lost its authority. "You can't just buy corporate debt like this." One of the investors near the front table stood up. "Actually," the man said slowly, "you can." All eyes turned toward him. The investor adjusted his glasses. "If Thorn Capital consolidated the loans, then technically they now control the debt structure of Carver Industries." Victor turned sharply. "What did you say?" The investor looked directly at me. "Which would mean," he continued, "this gentleman is now the largest creditor your company has." A wave of whispers moved through the ballroom. Victor looked back down at the document. His hands were shaking now. "Thorn Capital," he said quietly. Then he looked up at me again. His eyes widened. "You," he said slowly. "You're Harrison Thorn." The name moved through the room like electricity. And suddenly half the room stopped breathing. Several investors stood up immediately. A woman near the press table grabbed her phone. Victor took a step backward. "You've been hiding," he said. "For years." I shrugged slightly. "Peace and quiet has its advantages." Victor's voice rose suddenly. "You planned this." "No," I said calmly. "You did." The room grew even quieter. Victor pointed at Daniel. "That boy stole my company's technology." Victor shouted. "He should be in prison." Daniel stiffened beside me. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward him. I shook my head slowly. "No, Victor." I took one more step forward. "You fired him because you thought he was powerless." Victor opened his mouth to respond. But at that exact moment another phone rang near the stage. Then another. And another. Investors were checking their screens. Reading the same message. Carver Industries debt structure, transferred. Majority creditor, Thorn Capital. Victor looked around the room. For the first time in his life. No one was laughing. No one was applauding. They were watching him. And slowly. One by one. The people who had applauded him just minutes earlier. Began stepping away from Victor Carver. For a long moment, Victor Carver stood alone under the bright lights of the ballroom. The room that had applauded him just minutes earlier had grown strangely quiet. People were no longer standing beside his table. Investors had stepped back. Politicians were whispering to their assistants. Reporters were already typing messages into their phones. Victor looked around the room like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was gone. "You can't do this," he said, his voice no longer steady. I looked at him calmly. "I already did." Daniel stood beside me, silent. Victor's eyes moved toward him. You think this means you've won? Victor shouted bitterly. Daniel didn't answer. For the first time that night, he didn't look angry. He just looked finished. Come on, I said quietly. Daniel turned to me. We're leaving. Yes. Behind us the ballroom was still buzzing with quiet panic. Phones ringing. Investors arguing in low voices. Lawyers already being called. Victor Carver was shouting at someone near the stage, trying desperately to regain control of the room. But no one was listening anymore. Daniel and I walked toward the exit. No one tried to stop us. No one even looked in our direction. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. For a moment we both stood on the sidewalk looking at the city lights. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. So, what happens now? I handed him the folder Rebecca had prepared. He opened it slowly. Inside were the control documents for the debt structure of Carver Industries. For a moment he simply stared at the pages. Then he looked up at me. You're giving this to me? I nodded. You built the company once, I said. Now build it the right way. Daniel looked back down at the documents again. Across the street, the lights of the Meridian Hotel were still shining. Inside that building, Victor Carver was watching his empire collapse. But out here, the world was quiet again. Daniel closed the folder. And for the first time since I found him on that park bench, my son finally looked at peace. And the man who once called our bloodline worthless was now standing alone inside a ballroom full of witnesses, watching everything he built slowly slip out of his hands.